went on to McMaster University, and I went to grad school in the States, and I met my wife in Colorado, and that's where I was first exposed to the idea of a national park, Rocky Mountains National Park in Colorado. I did a postdoc in the Susquehanna Valley, which was a forested area, and that reconnected me with nature. And then I came out to take up a job in Calgary, University of Calgary, when it was just opening. And that's when I really started to get involved in parks. It was amazing to me that you were 50 miles away from a place that was still lots of grizzly bears, cougar. I was fortunate in getting into the parks just at the point where things were switching over from a very informal, protective kind of arrangement to one in which you eventually had master plans and management plans, all sides of bureaucratic efforts to try and organize and protect them, some of which were good, some of which were a bit misguided, in my view. But it was in the course of that geomorphic work, that ice work, that I began to see what was happening, and that got me concerned and got my students concerned. So that's how we started.
You've mentioned the pressure of an Olympic bid and an expansion at Lake Louise. Were these the catalysts for CPAWS, or was there another event or happening that led to the creation of the organization?
The Olympics issue was almost subterranean. It was being handled, I think, quite smoothly, as those things often are, by the people who proposed to hold them there. And I don't have anything against the Olympics per se, but it was the site, it was the idea of holding them in the park in the Upper Bow Valley. And that concerned a lot of people, the Alpine Mountain Club people and a lot of others. And then the Lake Louise thing, with a big proposal for hotels and expanded recreational facilities and large-scale tourism. That really excited a lot of other people who didn't like that kind of recreation appearing in the park. And the backcountry people got concerned about that. So there was a series of different groups that gradually coalesced around some of these issues. And conservation and environment became a big concern in the 60s. That was really an environmental decade. Ralph Nader and getting after the auto companies on pollution and accidents, and Paul Ehrlich and his wife doing biodiversity stuff, although they didn't call it that at the time. So it was young people getting involved, and to an extent it's almost unimaginable today. The economy and so on has changed so much. I got involved personally, and I think we were in a way a catalyst for the formation of the chapter, because I had some really good graduate students at the time, and they got interested in it because they were working in the park just as I was, or some of them were working around it. And they started having meetings and discussing it themselves. And then they asked me to join it, and we got involved to the point where I actually proposed a graduate course at the University of Calgary on the national parks, which caused some consternation in the faculty because nobody had ever heard of a course like that before, but they approved it. So a lot of students began to take that course, and they got interested. And then we started making contact with these people outside who were community members who were concerned about some of the same things. The big impression I have is that the challenges are constant. There's ebbs and flows. But this idea of eternal vigilance or constant vigilance is exceedingly important. You know, that there's the how many times has the Olympics come up? And I think there's some move now to raise the Olympics again. And there was what was it, 72? They had the Winter Olympics outside. The original proposal there was for, again, holding them in the parks. But they went to Spray Lakes and so on and developed the facilities there. Yeah. So that's a good example of an issue where you have a park like Banff, and there's similar examples all across the country that have resources that a continuing stream of people who get into the tourist industry, and they change from generation to generation, see as opportunities to develop their own enterprises and their own interests. So you got to be constantly vigilant. Master plans, you got to make sure that they're always adhering to the master plans. And there's enormous examples of misfortunes under the Harper regime with respect to Lake Louise and other things with regard to wilderness and parliamentary wilderness category. So you have to watch that. But the Olympics is a constant and outstanding issue. The extent and nature of wilderness and its role in the parks vis-a-vis tourism and other zoning, the nature of zoning, the intensity of zoning, the seriousness of zoning, that's an ongoing issue. Transport and roads and access, constant ongoing issue. The still unsolved issue of people. More and more people wanting to do more and more things in the park, and the commitment of Canada on an almost wholesale basis to growth, something that has to end at some point somehow. It has to diminish somehow. That continues to put pressure on parks. The desire for ever higher incomes, more and more prosperity, more and more enjoyment of life, more and more seeking happiness, all that puts pressure on the parks. So you have these things that are pinpoints for some of these long-standing themes, but I think it's the themes and the identification of the themes that are things that stand out in my mind. I think there are probably two pretty critical issues. So there's probably three things: getting your ideas right, communicating them effectively, and raising money to be able to do it all. That's really my impression anyway. Well, I think that climate change is already underway, as I said earlier, and it'll probably cause all sorts of changes in slopes, and there is a potential risk that there will be a major slide or a major collapse with the melt of permafrost or with the melt of permanently frozen ground. And that might block a stream, in which case
the whole watershed
there's going to be a whole change in the watershed, or at least in a significant part of it. Conceivably, Prairie Creek could be affected in that way. Nobody really has a good grip yet on how some of that is going to affect specific areas like the Nahanni. It's of interest ecologically, of course, because of the change in the wildlife populations that are occurring. I mean, there's not an awful lot that can be done about that. I mean, we've pushed so far with the changes, and we still, as mankind, resist growth and enormous amounts of energy that we dispense, to the point where even if you stopped now and held at present levels, you would still have the buildup in heat and collapse that hasn't occurred yet, and it's bound to occur with the changes in temperature. So it's kind of a wait and see from my point of view. From a scientific point of view, it's invaluable as an area. They were doing glacial change studies in the upper part of the Ragged Range in the sort of southwest corner of the park. And they were cut off a few years ago because of lack of funding. But that would have been invaluable to know what was happening to that glacier and what was happening to the park indirectly as a result, and the ice indirectly as a result. Well, I don't know that there's any standard model. Take somebody like Harvey Locke. Harvey Locke is intense in his commitment to wilderness and to the idea of wilderness and to making it bigger and to making it more protective. Now, I almost look at Harvey as sort of a intense ball of fire who will continue to burn. And you can't say what his motivation is. He was raised in Banff. He knows Banff. Maybe that's it in his case.
People are passionate about their local issues.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Gavin Henderson was, who was the very important first executive director, was an Englishman who came over, and he had a training in agricultural technology. And he, I don't know what jobs he did earlier, but he got involved, and he was an animal rights kind of person. And a lot of people with those kinds of feelings get involved. That was what motivates them. And you don't necessarily get harmony between an animal rights point of view on conservation and a broader wildlands or biodiversity point of view. You get the scientists. There's scientists who get into it because it relates to what they study and what they do and what they do research on. Sense of beauty. Some people get involved because they have a sense of the beautiful in the wild. So it's not, I don't think it's, I've thought about this quite a bit. I thought, is there some way you could identify a group of people who would be consistently supportive of these issues and that you could build on in a regular planned kind of way? And to some degree there is, but every individual is different, and you get some surprising people. Al Frame was a petroleum engineer, as I recall, and he worked on the oil sands. He was one of the first people to develop the processes to refine the oil sands and develop the oil sands industry. And yet he had and he also loved woodworking, but he had a really interesting view on nature. To him it was beautiful. He liked to walk in it. He liked the trees. This place attracted me because it was so well known. Raymond Patterson and others had written books on it, the Dangerous River and so on for years, so you knew about it that way. It was also a place that was alluring to me because we flew all around it. I went to all kinds of places other than the Nahanni over a 10 or 15 year period. And I did a lot of work on in Yellowknife. So it was a sort of allure of the place that caused me to think about it. And then when I was following the work you guys were doing on getting it as a national park, and I had been following it for years. I was involved on the board. I think I was president at the time that the first proposals were made for this park and for Iwatuq on South Baffin Island, and for Kluane. And so I watched them all ever since. And I worked with John a little bit, John Taberge, on Kluane. Kluane was in many ways prime effort by John Taberge. He did lots of research up there. He worked up there for a long time. When you guys were working on this and it was coming to fruition, I followed that closely. And then when it ended, I knew that the thing had been on the burner from 1969 or 1970 when the first proposals officially came out, and 2009 when the expansion occurred.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought to myself, boy, that's really something that people should think about. And so then I began to think, well, I should maybe write it up. So the first thing was, I was doing a book of essays at the time, so I contacted Allison and Stephen Woodley because I knew they had done some work up there, and I asked them if they had any materials. And then I wrote a paper, about a 20-page paper, and I looked at it and I sent it to some people, and I'd forgotten who it was. Somebody said, you should do a book on this. So then I began to think about the point you raised. Well, it's probably worthwhile doing a book because nobody ever records these things. I don't think there's a book like this in Canada that I can think of, and I know a fair amount about the literature, that actually tells the story of what happened to a place that became a national park and all the ramifications of that, which I certainly didn't capture completely in the book. But the intricacies of changing ideas, changing minds, changing science, all that stuff affects it. So I thought that would be a motivation as well. And then it slowly dawned on me as I worked on it that it was an opportunity to present a lot of ideas about what I had learned over the years. And so the book is built on the idea of changing thinking about national parks in Canada. Mm-hmm. The idea of going from an ideal vision of a place where people had never been, which archaeology and history since the 60s have shown is an increasingly unreachable idea. I mean, virtually every part of Canada was visited in one way or another by First Nations people over 12,000 years. So that has had to be modified. So that's in there. Mm-hmm. And the changes in the organization of parks, and the increasing role of local people, and the role of science. Enormous changes in science, ecosystem science in the 1970s. Nobody had ever really talked about that in a historic sense. So it's kind of a history of science in its own way. It's a history of park science. So I managed to put a lot of that stuff together in the book, and it was a lot of fun doing it. It probably took me about 5 years of intense work to do it this way, but the ideas go back to the 70s or 60s, and drew in all that to do it. And I'm thinking about maybe doing something similar for one or two other parks now.